So this section now is about research into teaching. And I know it has been already a quite long day and a quite intense day. So I hope everybody still has some energy left for these last sessions. So here I was asked to show some examples how research could inform teaching of strategy. And I thought that's quite easy because some of you might know I'm doing a lot on open strategy. And here I'm working also together with a lot of organizations about how they are opening up their strategy process. And I thought I'd show some examples on those, but then we agreed on maybe we are not presenting something on open strategy this year, as I have already presented something on the topic in last year's workshop session. So I was somehow facing the challenge to present new research, which is not an open strategy, but which is quite current. So this is a project which goes back, I have to say, to some research interests of mine many years ago. And it is done together with research colleagues, Stefano Lipira from the University of Warwick, Christian Stadler from the University of Warwick, and Michael Meyer from the Technical University of Chemnitz. We have it's still work in progress, and it refers to, I think, themes that most of you might teach when you are teaching undergraduate strategy courses, because it focuses on corporate diversification strategy. Now, we have one chapter in the book that is specifically dedicated to corporate level strategy, and that is also discussing diversification. Chapter 9, I have always tried in the slides to highlight the references to the different sections in the books and how this could be used to connect current research topics to topics that we teach in strategy classes. Now, this research paper or research project is on diversification and somehow on drivers of diversification. This has long been a research interest of mine, also to investigate what might cause different levels of product diversification that could be found among firms. And there is excessive research on this, what might motivate firms to focus on diversification. And there is also research that we discuss in the book that shows that excessive research, unrelated research, diversification might cause performance declines. Now, this research is a little bit different as we focus specifically on diversification and here the role of CEOs. And we see diversification here as a strategy that also allows to create some stability, income stability, performance stability, which reduces variability of a performance and therefore focus on avoiding the lower side of performance, so to say. And here we have specifically focused on CEOs and their roles, their individual motivations that might go beyond organizational goals just to create synergies, to achieve economies of scale, to achieve sharing of resources and capabilities across different business units and industries that are typically discussed in when you discuss diversification. Because there are also agency theoretical considerations that say, okay, individual CEOs might be tempted to pursue diversification also based on individual motives related to increasing power, status, which comes with increased size of organizations, but also to benefit their own career perspectives as they also reduce employment risks, income risks by drawing on this stability function of diversification, which might somehow be protective for individual CEOs as they could protect themselves from negative consequences of lower performance if they are only active in one focused company focusing on one industry that is facing downturn. So we focus specifically on CEOs. And here I want to highlight that most research has focused on typical CEOs. And I say on purpose typical CEOs by showing these pictures, as most of the time research has focused on male CEOs, but has ignored a large proportion, or let's say a larger proportion of female CEOs. So in this research project, we have specifically focused on how the decision to diversify a company or not might be different among male and female CEOs. And here we see some statistics that although the number of CEOs, here is a number relating to the Fortune 500 companies over the last years, it has been increasing, but it's still very low at around 10%. So, but we have seen some improvements, and there might be some reasons to expect that female CEOs might have different considerations in the context of diversification in terms of their companies. So what might be reasons that female CEOs might come to different conclusions in terms of diversification than their male counterparts? There is increasing research that shows that, of course, increasing the number of women on board in general, but also having female CEOs brings in some diversity in terms of women might bring in different career trajectories, might bring in different backgrounds. So you increase cognitive diversity of a top management team in total. But, and I think that's the most scaring a part of the story, is that research also shows that there is different societal expectations that are still there concerning female CEOs compared to male CEOs. So previous research has shown that female CEOs are still subject of greater external scrutiny. So there is much harsher evaluations going on in companies with female CEOs compared to male CEOs, either by the media coverage, by investor reactions, by activist investors that are approaching companies. And what you can see that there is a higher likelihood of this dismissal of female CEOs, and you can already see that when female CEOs are negotiating their severance agreements at the point of appointment. So they are already expecting this higher likelihood of negative evaluations. And there is also research that more negative prior performance is more negatively evaluated in the context of a female CEO, but it's not the case for male CEOs. So a lot of differences in terms of how strategic choices and performance of female CEOs are evaluated. And finally, there is also research which comes from management, finance, that shows that females differ to male CEOs in terms of their risk aversion. There's a lot of research that has shown that female CEOs are more risk averse in their strategic decisions that they take. And based on all of those aspects together that we found in theory and in literature, we would assume that that might lead female CEOs to follow greater levels of diversification, particularly in order to minimize the downsides of performance and the downside risks and get some more performance stability and control for variation in performance. So that's the first part of the story that we were interested in terms of this research project, but it goes on and it connects to cognitive biases that might be reflected in the decisions of strategic leaders and CEOs. And there is also a section in chapter 17 of the book that shows and introduces those different biases that leaders might face when they are making strategic decisions. I've just provided you a big list on the different kind of biases that are also discussed in the chapter. But in this research project, we focus on a very specific one. And this one is reflected in those I would say, very famous examples of male CEOs or actors that play male CEOs. So some of you might be able to guess the cognitive bias I'm talking about. It is overconfidence. Because overconfidence is one of the most prominent and most common cognitive biases also among CEOs. And it is defined as overestimating one's performance, one's abilities, one's ability to make accurate predictions, and ascribing successful performance and good outcomes to your own abilities and your own capabilities and being better than the others. Now, we thought it might be interesting in our story on female CEOs to always introduce this cognitive bias and see how overconfidence among female CEOs might impact the story. So we now have come up with this relationship that female CEOs might prefer more diversified companies for the reasons that I've just sketched out. But then we said, if those female CEOs are now overconfident, this might mitigate this preference for more diversification, because the more overconfident a female CEO is, the more, the less she might be concerned about the risks that she's taking, the less she might be concerned by negative performance outcomes, by this performance variability, the more she might be confident that her abilities allow her to avoid negative outcomes or those downsides that I've described. And now, to make it even more complex, we said, okay, female CEOs and CEOs in general are not acting in isolation in their teams when they are making those decisions in terms of diversifying, in terms of going into other businesses, in terms of going into other industries, but they are, of course, always interacting with their top management team. And then we said it might be interesting to see if the representation of additional women on the top management team might have consequences on this relationship. Because there is increasingly more research that shows that there is a very complex relationship between female CEOs and female top management team members. It's not entirely clear how it is and how it works. First studies show that female CEOs are less likely to appoint female managers within the top management team, that then those female top managers are earning less and are making less riskier decisions. But there's only first research. So based on what is there in our arguments that we put up in this project, we would assume that the more female top management team members you can find, the more likely those arguments that I came already up in terms of female CEOs might become evident and important, and might again reduce the mitigating effect of overconfidence, and again go towards more diversification than would have been the case if there are no female top management team members. As I said, that's already only work in progress. We have captured data on listed US firms just to be able to also measure and operationalize all the variables we are interested in, a long observation period over many years that we compiled. We are capturing diversification based on established measures. Maybe interesting for you, overconfidence is captured based on the personal portfolio decisions of CEOs, because more overconfident CEOs might be more willing to hold their stocks, because they might be convinced that the stock price would even increase based on their own abilities. And based on that, we investigated our hypothesis, and indeed, I won't bother you with any technical details here, but indeed found first support for all our three hypotheses. As I've said, that's just a first evidence that we got from this data. We are currently doing a lot of robustness checks, and additional tests. But to conclude and link it back to a classroom, such research, we thought it's interesting to engage in discussions with students based on various aspects. First of all, discussing what might be reasons to diversify if you are an organization, if you are the CEO of an organization, what might go beyond synergy, creating motivations. Also bringing in the CEO as a person with his or her cognitive biases into the equation, and how such cognitive individual biases might impact decisions. This is a great way to make students aware that such biases exist, to engage in some experiments with students, testing different biases. There are many experiments out there that could be easily done with students in the classroom, testing anchoring biases or different kind of cognitive biases in the classroom. And then, of course, and this is a topic which is also close to my heart, discussing the role of female CEOs, female top managers in making such big decisions, and what complex interplay between top management team members, CEOs, and we haven't even discussed the role of the board yet, might come into play if we take all of those aspects into consideration. So hopefully that research was a little bit of an inspiration for all of you on how research can be linked with different topics in the book, and of course also a call for everybody to see how you can link your research efforts and your research emphasis with the different aspects in the book and the concepts that then are discussed in the book a little bit deeper. And of course, happy to engage with questions and comments also on the chat.
Thank you very much, Julia. It's a great presentation on your research, one wing of your research. This is another wing of your research I'm very glad to be working with you on. And this is on strategy frameworks. We teach a lot of strategy frameworks. And even some of us try and develop strategy frameworks. But many people accuse us of being basically in vain and failing. Hang on, I'm not able to move this on. Hang on. That we as academics are failing in our production of strategy frameworks. Why? Right, here, thank you. So Dan Shandell, who was founded the Strategic Management Journal and the Strategic Management Society, basically argued that academics had failed in an article 3 or 4 years ago now in Strategic Management Review. He argued that consultants have their fingers on the pulse. It's they who are able to gather the right resources in terms of teams of people to work on the development of strategy frameworks, and they who are closest in touch with what business actually wants. So we academics, so this is Dan Shandell writing 40 years after founding the Strategic Management Journal. Basically, he was saying, we failed. Well, that was provocative. So I wanted to ask whether these strategy frameworks are, one, popular, because we teach them, and two, what sort of role academics have in them. And then three, implicitly, I want to raise an issue of how we teach strategy frameworks. And I want to imply a third way of teaching strategy frameworks. You can either say they're wonderful analytical devices, plug in and play tools for generating strategies, or you could say they're foolish wastes of time and they don't really help in the real world. I'm going to offer a third way, okay? So, 2 questions about strategy frameworks. How far has academia drifted from practice, really? And how should we teach these things? The strategy frameworks I have in mind are the kinds of things you probably recognize at the bottom of the slide. And indeed, these are all frameworks that the Boston Consulting Group, Martin Reeves, in particular, chairman of their Henderson Institute, their research lab, has generated through a number of ways, trawling the academic literature, looking at the publications of major strategy consulting firms, and then interviews with leading academic CEOs and senior consultants. He identifies 81 strategy frameworks developed between 1958 and 2013. So his data basically finished about 2015 when he started publishing on this. And Pankaj Ghemawat, a prominent strategy academic, has used this and curated this list as well in Business History Review. There's a nice article, actually. So, Dan Shendell said we were wasting our time. Excuse me, I'm just going to shut the door. And that strategy consulting firms had taken over. Well, is that true? If we look at the 81 strategy frameworks that the Boston Consulting Group, not a bunch of academics, the Boston Consulting Group generated, actually, academics are in the lead very consistently. And that's particularly interesting if you start looking at the history. So the Ford and Carnegie reports are two famous reports on business schools dating from the 1950s, and they recommended huge investments by academics in research. They said business schools weren't doing enough research. In the 1960s, BCG was founded, one of the more analytical, research-oriented strategy consulting firms, and both BCG and McKinsey launched their publications for the first time, Perspectives and McKinsey Quarterly, which are still available and being published. At the same time, academics were founding their own division, the Business Policy and Strategy Division at the Academy of Management in the 1970s. And as I touched on, 1980s, SMS and SMJ were founded by Dan Shendell. And then in the 1990s, you saw both McKinsey and BCG setting up their own institutes, research institutes, and we saw the same thing at the big four accounting firms. So PwC did the same in 1998 as well. So what do you see? You see the strategy academics investing in their research and the consulting firms investing in research. But over time, the lead from the academics has increased. So our work as academics appears not to be entirely in vain. And indeed, if you start examining exactly what was going on in the invention of many of these techniques, even by the consulting firms or by business, you will see that, in fact, academics exercise a great deal of influence on these, either through a collaboration or adaptation. Our original term for the adaptation was theft by consultants of academic ideas. We thought that was a bit strong, and we moved away from that, but they, shall we say, adapt. Sometimes they're inspired by academic ideas actually which come from outside the business school world. So the Red Queen effect or the tipping point effects come from the sciences, the hard sciences, rather than business schools, but nonetheless there's inspiration. Or with the 7S's, the McKinsey 7S's, you had combinations. So Pascal and Athos from Stanford Business School and Harvard Business School worked very closely with Tom Peters, who had only just a year before developing the 7S's finished his PhD at the University of Stanford. So you get many influences of strategy academics upon these tools, but by and large, academics are the most productive. How should we teach these? I mean, the argument is that academics are supplying tools which are very effective, which are regarded as salient by BCG and the chief executives they consulted with. And we were involved in it. At the same time, we have somewhat nihilistic approaches to strategy. I'm singling out Robert Cheer and Robin Holt here, who take a basically Mansbergian view that strategy is about emergence. The strategy tools focus too much on navigation in a stormy seas, and therefore are distracting. And produced, go back to Julia's concept, misplaced overconfidence. There's a third way. Paula Jozkowski and Sarah Kaplan advocate effectively this. They say that actually it's not that strategy tools provide the plug-in and play answer. It's not that They create overconfidence, and they're overwhelmed by events in reality, emergence, the sort of Mintzbergian or Cheer and Hautz view. Is that strategy tools actually fulfill many different functions. They have affordances. In other words, they afford different possibilities. Just as water will allow you to, oh, I gave you the stepping, the book affords many possible actions. Okay, so what that implies is a change in teaching. So simply not saying that the analytical tools will give you the answer, not saying a la Mintzberg that they're a foolish distraction, but to say they can achieve many things in the strategy process, building consensus, delineating territories, maybe some politics, building up understanding, especially in open strategy. I think that's particularly important, something that Julia talked about. I think of strategy tools, the orthodox tools, as a kind of lingua franca of strategy. Everybody has access to them. And if people want to get involved in open strategy, they're a great way of thinking about it. So strategy tools developed by academics quite successfully. Strategy tools doing more than what we actually sell them for. They're more than navigational devices, more than just doing analysis. They can have other affordances. That's the Jarzakowski and Kaplan contribution. How does that affect our teaching? Well, I'm going to suggest it's the third way. We should talk about navigation. We should talk about emergence. Mintzberg had many truths, so do Robin Holt and Robert Cheer. But we should also introduce the affordances of strategy tools into our teaching. So I suggest that when we talk about evaluating strategies, there's a section in 13.3.4 which talks about the complexity of evaluation in practice. I think some of that complexity is around using the tools as ways of developing consensus. The same as strategy development processes, let's not be nihilistic when we talk about emergent strategy processes, Mintzberg, but let's be more constructive and say, what affordances do the tool offer? And chapter 17 has a section on methods. And again, we can introduce the various methods. We talk about projects and we talk about away days. What other affordances beyond developing strategy do these methods have? And the strategy lenses, the strategy as discourse lens, talks about strategy discourse, or the way we talk about it, the tools, the rhetorics. They too have many, many different affordances, sometimes inclusive, sometimes inclusionary, sometimes they're political power plays, but they have more affordances than simple analysis. There are a number of strategy cases which we have, which do focus on particular tools and would afford you, or would allow you, to talk about affordances of these various tools in discussing the cases. I mentioned hydrogen pipe dreams, the vision statements in the Siemens case, the Hoshin Cannery, where we have a thinking differently as well on Hoshin Cannery in the dual 7 Portable Laget. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that at all correctly. And there's also one on the city of Vasa, where they talk about strategy maps and open strategy. So strategy tools, academics, not so bad. Strategy tools, not the answer, not plug in and play analytical answer, but not useless, as Mintzberg might argue. They have many different affordances, and I think it'd be good to introduce those into one's teaching of strategy. And that's where I close. Thank you. Does anyone have any queries or extra thoughts on that? Or should we take a short break? I don't know. Rufus, you're in charge.
Clive has just put his hand up, so you may have a question.
Clive.
It was just a kind of casual looking at your early chart, Richard. Then would the slightly more cynical consultants say that we're measuring input and numbers of frameworks rather than kind of value and impact of frameworks? Is there comparable research on that?
Yes, so what BCG did was they surveyed their clients basically on what were their most valuable, or they used the word, slightly strange word, salient strategic frameworks. So this effectively comes from practice, though they also consulted the academic literature and they also consulted academics. So I think it's a little bit idiosyncratic. I think Julia might feel the same about one or two of the techniques which we included. There's an oddly large number from BCG, perhaps oddly, but intriguingly large. One of them, which I'm not sure is quite Martin Reeves, is credited to Martin, but by and large, they're the usual suspects. You can see some of them I put on the screen here. So I don't think many of them would surprise you. A few do. It'd be interesting to see whether there are other things that should go on. Clive, does that help? Or reassure a bit?
I think it probably reassures a bit. And of course, you know, we only have to look at your slide, Richard, and they are all appallingly familiar.
Yes.
But hopefully that's good news as well as a cause for concern.
Yeah, most of the 81, it's slightly frightening how many there are, will be, if not appallingly familiar, somewhat.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
I think we should take, Rufus, a 5-minute break before going into the swap shop, which is basically challenges, solutions, and bright, cool ideas. I've got a few which I've taken from the Padlet. And I just, you know, how do you work with a group who are both not-for-profit and for-profit oriented? How do you manage to bridge those? How do you do the digital teaching? Rufus may have something to contribute on that. The declining levels of engagement in this, I think Jackie actually mentioned this, in this true COVID generation. These are the ones who suffer. The students we have now, the undergraduates now, were the ones who are suffering from the COVID lockdowns during their last school years. Simulations, and then some bright ideas. I hope Sylvia is around, could talk about Netflix and Spotify. That was a nice one. Debates between the two teachers and how to handle that. Maybe we'll talk about that. But please put on the Padlet a number of ideas and then be ready maybe to talk about some of these, or pull these in about 5 minutes time. Does that make sense?
Yes, if we come back at 5:02.
Yeah, 5:02 makes sense. But look at the Padlet and see what you want to go with. Thank you.